Welcome back to class. In this session, we're going to look at the major themes of chapters 20 and 21 in Daniel Jurgen's The Prize. In these chapters, Jurgen is going to explain the post-World War II settlement of the Persian Gulf region. And he is updating then his explanation or narration in chapter 10 of the post-World War I settlement of the region. If you remember our discussion then, we left kind of in the mid-1820s, late 1820s, parts of this region had been allowed to develop into their own autonomous nations. So Turkey and Saudi Arabia, most importantly, but also Kuwait and Lebanon. But other parts of this region were left under League of Nations mandates. Syria, Iraq, and Palestine. Despite these very different political designations, however, it was created as a single region for the purposes of legalizing oil concessions with it. If you remember the creation of the Turkish Petroleum Company, that international conglomerate of American, British, and French companies, plus this Mr. 5%, they essentially formed an international cartel in which they had a mutual agreement that wherever oil was discovered anywhere within the red line, they would share that oil according to the percentages that they had agreed on when they created the company. Now remember, Iran, or Persia at the time, was never part of the red line agreement. It always stood just outside of it, even though it's a critical piece of this region and the oil production that's going to come out of this region. It had that distinct political status. Jurgen opens chapter 20 with the story of this character Everett Lee de Goyer, who is an American geologist exploring the Persian Gulf in the middle of World War II. He opens in this story from 1943. And so de Goyer is exploring the region, and he's really the first person to imagine that there are significant oil reserves underneath those vast sand dunes. It's kind of endless mile after mile after mile of sand dunes, and it's de Goyer who's the first one to suspect, I bet there's oil underneath there. Now, if you remember from chapter 10, the best geology of this period is trained to look for oil resources in mountains, right? Think of the classic image of the mountains of northwest Pennsylvania. So the British and the French, with the Turkish Petroleum Company, are particularly interested in the northern regions of Iraq, because that's where that mountain chain that forms the southern boundary of Iran sort of extends up and starts to leach over, if you will, or spread over the political boundary between Iraq and Iran. So really for the British, the big game in the post-World War I period is to get access to those northern Iraqi oil reserves, and then to connect enough regions south of it to give them a transportation network out to the Persian Gulf. Iraq as a country is a really artificial construction by the British for this purpose. So the French and the British are really pretty content to let those Americans muck around down in the southern portion of the Red Line Agreement, because they don't believe that there are any significant oil resources down there. The sand dunes, the deserts of the central Arabian Peninsula are sort of wasteland from the mindset of the most modern or sort of advanced geologists of the period. And so here comes this goofy de Goyer. It's a little bit like, if you recall, Patio Higgins in the East Plains of Texas, walking around with his oil witching stick. No one had ever had the idea that there could be oil underneath grass plains, and it was Higgins who had the first intuition that there's this whole new form of geologic structure that could also contain oil. De Goyer here is a kind of similar kind of character in Jurgen's story. Now, the political context here is just exponentially more complicated in 1943, 44, 45 through the end of the 40s than it certainly was in the late 19-teens and early 1920s. In that earlier period, kind of the legacy and the mindset and the institutional power of the imperial system was still very strong, right? And so it is much simpler as a political matter if you can just repress the native peoples with your soldiers and take the oil, which is essentially what happened after World War One. By the 1940s, as we come to the end of the World War II period, these oil companies are going to have to deal with autonomous nation states. And these nation states are not all in agreement. They're in intense rivalry with each other. And so part of the story here is, how do the Western companies come in and establish legal, valid, legitimate access to the oil resources of this region and deal with all the new governments that have been created. So as an introduction then to these chapters, let's spend just a couple of moments on each of these governments to give you a sense of the background story here that Jurgen is trying to tell. The three most important countries in this region in this period are Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and Iran. Now, Iran, as we've mentioned a couple times now, is a distinct thing. It was not part of the Ottoman Empire, and it hadn't been for a very long time at the time of World War I. And it had its own distinct monarchy and relationship with Britain. So we'll focus on that in the next slide. Here we want to focus on the different origins of Saudi Arabia and Iraq and the relationship that created between them in the post-war period. Now, if you go back to our discussion of chapters 9 and 10 and World War I, you will recall that the British conducted two campaigns in this region, the Palestine campaign and the Mesopotamia campaign. And you may remember me mentioning that in both of those campaigns, they actively recruited Arab allies, right? If the Arabs considered themselves a kind of colonized people by the Ottoman Empire, so the British kind of cultivated their resentment against the Ottomans and recruited them to bring fighters to contribute to the campaigns. And essentially any leader, the Arab leader that they could find who had soldiers that were willing to fight for him, the British repeatedly made promises of political autonomy in the aftermath of the war. That is to say, they made the same promise for the control of the same patch of land to multiple people over the course of the war. If you've seen the movie St. Lawrence of Arabia, which is kind of a classic of the 1950s, one of the first great early color films, it tells the story of this kind of British duplicity in their relationships with the Arabs during World War I. It's a wonderful movie. Now, if you boil all those different those different promises down, it's really two main families that the British promised the same thing to, essentially telling the leaders of both families, you are a great Arab leader. When the war is over, we'll have a nation for the Arab peoples, and the British will support you if you are going to become the ruler of this Arab nation. Right? So when you talk to Arabs of the people, they assume that what the British were talking about was a single Arab nation for all the Arab people, that is, all the peoples of the Arabian Peninsula, again, in much the same way that the Poles got Poland and the Czechs and the Slovaks got Czechoslovakia, etc., etc. The Arabs thought they were going to be treated in the same way that those Europeans were treated. That's not how it turned out. And so we want to distinguish between these two kind of family lineages, the nature of their claims, the kind of political legitimacy that they cultivated, and understand then how that leads the resulting countries to be in intense rivalry with each other, even as they share so much in common in their opposition to the West or their feelings of anti-colonialism. So if you look at the map in the upper right-hand corner of the screen, that's that corner of that image of the Ottoman Empire, focusing on the Arabian Peninsula. If you look at the southern boundary, that purple, if you recall, that's where the British had cultivated friendly relationships with local tribes so that they could have naval stations to recoal their ships as they were traveling back and forth from India. So that's the British down on the southern corner. The rest of the Arabian Peninsula is really divided into two areas. The green, which goes kind of around the coast of the peninsula itself, and that cream-colored, beige color in the interior. Right? So the green represents the region of effective Ottoman control. Right? So this whole area is technically under the Ottoman Empire jurisdiction, but they never have effective political control of the interior. Those are always kind of wild interior wastelands, kind of like our American frontier and the weakness of government authority out on the frontier. Going all the way back to the Romans, no imperial power had ever effectively ruled the interior of the Arabian Peninsula. So, the Hashemite family, or the Hashems, are a very long-standing kind of royal family of Arabia that had served as government officials under the Ottoman Empire. And most importantly, that kind of patriarch of the family, Hussein Hashem, he was the mayor, effectively, if you will, the sharif of the two most important cities on the peninsula, Mecca and Medina. To the extent that there's any kind of economic productivity or value in this region, it's a religious tourist industry to the holiest sites in all of Islam. Every Muslim in the world, no matter where you're born, has a religious obligation, if you can afford it, and there's a variety of charities to help you afford it if you can't on your own. Every Muslim is under an obligation to travel to Mecca once in their lifetime and to pray at the Grand Mosque. So every year, I think it's in the early spring, if I'm not mistaken, millions of Muslims from around the world all travel to Mecca, and very often up to Medina, which is another sacred site. And so there's a kind of very vibrant, even going back to the Middle Ages, long before the modern period, there's a sustained kind of tourism industry to accommodate these pilgrims along the way. So to the extent there's any kind of economic value in this region, it's that. And so the Ottomans install their royal officials to be the mayors, if you will, of these important cities. Recruiting these family members is very important to the British because it gives them, if you will, it's the access, to the extent that there are resources and, military equipment and whatnot being stationed down here. By recruiting the Hashems to their cause to overthrow the Ottomans, the British are getting access to the most important gear that they can, right? These are the wealthiest, most entrenched kind of power figures in the Ottoman Empire's kind of imperial bureaucracy, if you will. So the Hashems are going to have a strong claim on being the rulers of whatever nation is created in the aftermath of World War I. On the other hand is this House of Saud, or the family of Saud, Ibn Saud there. You see the grand patriarch at the top of the family tree. He represents, if you will, kind of the wild frontiersman from the interior of the peninsula. Saud does not rule over any major cities. He is essentially a nomadic warrior, and he traverses the Arabian interior with his bands of warriors, but he also recognizes himself and his followers, if you will, as the true Arabs, right? Those dirty Hashems have sold out to the Ottomans. They're not true Arabs. They're puppets of the imperial power. We, the Sauds, and our followers, that's kind of guerrilla fighters, if you will. It's a little bit like, Daniel Boone or Davy Crockett or something in American frontier lore, or George Custer or something like that, right? He's a rough rider. They're uncouth, they're primitive, they're uncivilized, unlike those fancy pants kind of effeminate rulers that live in their big palaces in the big cities. Ibn Saud and his followers are the rough riders from the interior. And so they form a very effective guerrilla fighting force that are fighting the Ottomans alongside of the British, and that's really the main focus. If you do check out that movie, Lawrence of Arabia, it's really about this character, Sir Lawrence, who's a British officer, and his relationship with Ibn Saud and Ibn Saud's warriors. So at the end of the war, the British have essentially promised to these two different Arab rulers that you will get to be in charge of whatever nation is created at the end of the war. Now, you already have a sense of how that turned out, and the British essentially pulling the rug out from underneath the Arabs over and over again. But it's not quite as bad as it seems, because as the British were dividing this region up, they gave different portions to different members of each of these families. Saudi Arabia, the modern nation state of Saudi Arabia, is that lower half the British gave sort of wholesale over to Ibn Saud. Saudi Arabia means the Arabia of the family of Saud. Now, of course, the British were eager to do this because the British thought there's nothing really of value. The British don't put any particular value on controlling the Hajj pilgrimage in the cities of Mecca and Medina. They have their hands full, certainly, just trying to govern Jerusalem and all the chaos and conflict that's happening in the northern part of this region known as the Hijaz. They're not particularly jealous of or motivated to maintain control of Mecca and Medina. And so as long as those coastal states are left alone, that they Aden and Oman and Bahrain and Qatar, etc., then they're really quite happy to just leave the House of Saud in charge of the rest of the peninsula. Because what the British are especially interested in, of course, is the division of the northern part of the Arabian Peninsula. That'll be designated under those League of Nations mandates, with Syria and Iraq in particular, and then Palestine, because they're kind of stuck with it. Right? So for those other divisions then, they're going to turn to the House of Hashem, and they're going to pick sort of the descendants of the original Hussein Hashem, his sons Ali, Abdullah, and Faisal, and they're going to put different members in charge of different groups. So Abdullah, very quickly, Jordan will be separated from Palestine. The kind of region to the east of the Jordan Mountains is going to be separated. It's called Transjordan originally, and then eventually it'll get the name just Jordan. And so one kind of family branch of the Hashem family is assigned to be the monarchs of Jordan. And to this very day, it's the descendants of that very same family who continue to rule Jordan. It is the most stable monarchical line that comes out of this period. Now, it's the other branch of the family that gives the British all the trouble. They take Faisal, son of Hussein, and they install him as the king of Syria in 1920. So he's going to rule for the French under the French mandate, and the British are happy with that because they have this relationship with the Hashem family. So to have a Hashem in charge of the French protectorate gives the British influence over there. But almost immediately, the Syrians are going to rise up in a revolution against having a monarchy imposed on them. The Syrians are going to drive Faisal from the throne and establish a kind of, it's a parliamentary system. It's maybe a little too much to call it a democracy, but it's definitely an elective and representative system that gets established in Syria in the 1920s. But the British, in order to compensate Faisal and to make sure that the Hashem family feels like they've gotten their due after World War I, takes that very same Faisal who's just been kicked off the throne of Syria and said, okay, you want to be king of Iraq? And Faisal says, sure. So the British declare Faisal to be the king of Iraq in 1921. And it's going to be the descendants of that family, the two sons of Faisal, are going to continue to rule Iraq until 1958. And then we'll come back to this. There's going to be a bloody revolution that overthrows the Hashem kings in Iraq. And ultimately, we're going to get Saddam Hussein and the Ba'ath Party ruling Iraq. And hopefully you're familiar with that name. So in Iraq, there is both in Syria and in Iraq, there is a popular resistance. You know, the people in this region are deeply resentful of the effort by the British to force a monarchy upon them. The Hashem family then is always going to carry this kind of stained legacy that they were only able to be in charge because they had the military backing of the Western powers, reinforcing their rule and suppressing the local population. The family of Saud and the history of Saud is very, very different. The Saud family, Ibn in particular, is going to base the legitimacy on his rule that he has been given responsibility for protecting the sacred cities of Mecca and Medina. And so the Sauds are going to cultivate an image of themselves as the most pure Muslims, right? They are going to be the most Muslim of all the Muslim rulers, and it's the kind of purity of their religious devotion, and that they support and sustain a whole network of imams, right, of religious teachers, kind of the equivalent in Christian terms of ministers and priests, if you will. That the House of Saud will become the major benefactor of Islamic clergy and teachers, really throughout the world, but especially in the Arabian Peninsula. And they're going to cultivate themselves as sort of the most advanced or the most pure Muslims in the world, the leaders of all. A little bit like they don't declare themselves to be the caliph, if you're familiar with that term, caliphate, but in many ways claiming the kind of cultural authority, if you will, as a support for their political rule that the caliphate claimed in the early ages of the Islamic Empire. So Saudi Arabia is going to be always in rivalry with both Iraq and Syria, and Jordan, because those countries, the rulers of those countries, are going to represent the kind of Arabs serving as puppets to European powers, a continuation of the 19th century imperial system. Now, Iran is a very different story, and it's really important that we make these distinctions among these different, what are becoming nationalities. We in the West, sort of understandably so, tend to conflate these different groups together because they're all from the same, what we perceive as the same region, the Middle East, and because all of these countries are Islamic or Muslim, and we tend to think of Islam as much a cultural category as a religious category. We would not, for instance, tend to confuse, say, the Dutch with the Portuguese just because they both happen to be Christian. In our minds, we would think, no, the Dutch are very distinct people from the Portuguese, but we tend to conflate the same kind of differences within this region. The Persians and the Arabs are distinct ethnographic groups going back really thousands of years. In kind of crude anthropological terms, you want to think of the Arabs as the desert peoples and the Persians as the mountain peoples in this region that is the cradle of human civilization. We also tend to conflate these different nationalities because most of the images, the media images that you are likely to have seen about Iran are images since the 1979 Islamic Revolution. And we'll talk much more about that later in the course and what a dramatic change that was for Iran. But Iran was a very different place before the 1979 revolution. We've already talked about its kind of unique geopolitical position. It is not part of the Ottoman Empire. It's its own autonomous monarchy all through the 19th century. The British cultivate friendly relationships with what's known as the Qajar, Qajar family dynasty. So they cultivate friendly relationships both because, as we mentioned, they need to have forts and bases along the Indian Ocean coast to refill their coal ships, but also because they see Iran or Persia at the time as a buffer between their own imperial holdings in India and the expansion of the Russian Empire to the north of them. And so they're eager to have an independent monarchy right there in the Persian mountains as a kind of buffer state between these two great empires. Now, the Iranian ruler in the aftermath of World War II is Reza Mohammad Pahlavi. This is the same guy who will be overthrown in 1979, and his title is Shah, which is a kind of rough equivalent of king, if you will. Now, the Pahlavi family are a relatively new monarchical family. After World War I, Reza's grandfather was a colonel, I believe, in the Persian army. He led a group of military officers in a kind of junta overthrow revolution against the Qajar monarch and established the Pahlavi family on the throne. Reza's dad inherited the throne when the original Pahlavi died in the mid-30s, but it turns out that Reza's dad was sort of pro-fascist in his sympathies leading up to World War II, and so the British came in and deposed and assassinated Reza's father and offered Reza the throne. So we again have this example of a local, this time at least a local person though, who gets his throne or gets his office and political power by virtue of British and in alliance with the Americans' military support. However, because Persia has such a long-standing relationship with the British, the government the Shah constructs is really attempting to mimic the British model. So he sees himself as a monarch or a king, but he wants to rule in conjunction with a parliament or a national legislature, and that's what he creates. We'll come back to Mohammad Mossadegh, who was the prime minister from 1951 to 1953. He's the most famous of these Iranian legislative leaders. But what the Shah is imagining is a system much like the British, where they have a king and a national parliament. Now, in the British system, the monarch is really just a figurehead, right? They're a symbolic leader, an important one, but they have very little actual constitutional authority. What the Shah imagines here in Iran is more of a kind of balanced constitutional role, that he would be the constitutional executive ruling in collaboration with his national legislature. In both cases, though, this is a dramatically different model than the ones we've been talking about within those former Ottoman lands, that is in Syria, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Lebanon, etc. Now we're going to watch this system get sort of upset long before the 1979 revolution. Mossadegh is going to lead a movement to nationalize the Iranian oil resources. That is to say, essentially to kick the British out of the country's oil refining business. We'll come back to that in a coming class session. But the model is exactly this Western model. So all the way up to the 79 revolution, Iran is by far the most westernized of all of these Middle Eastern countries. You see these kind of members of parliament, and they're wearing the European suits. You see the women in the image in the lower right-hand corner wearing European fashions. It's very common in Iran in the 1950s and the 1960s for women to go to college and become, doctors and teachers and lawyers and many other professions. Very different than the story we're going to tell about the nations just on the other side of the Mesopotamian border, right? What the kind of cultural developments we're going to talk about in relation to Saudi Arabia and Iraq and Syria, etc. The Shah is going to become the most important kind of geostrategic partner of the United States by the era of the Nixon presidency, and we'll come back to that again. The Shah is going to see Iran as a partner with the United States in implementing a common foreign policy. He wants to see himself as kind of the hegemonic military power in the region and the right-hand man of the greatest superpower on the planet, and we're going to watch Iran follow a very different kind of trajectory towards national autonomy than we have seen, or a kind of culture of nationalism than we have seen in these other nations that we mentioned. Now, Kuwait is yet again a different kind of story of the path to nationhood for these different Arab peoples. Kuwait is not going to play a prominent role in the story that Jürgen wants to tell in the succeeding chapters, so we won't spend a lot of time on Kuwait in this class, but taking note of the origins of Kuwait points out, if you will, the kind of artificiality or the externally imposed nature of the other nations being created in these couple of decades. I have already referred to the kind of origins of all those coastal Persian Gulf states, those little sheikdoms or princedoms along the coast of the Persian Gulf: Yemen, Oman, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Bahrain. Those are regions that sort of gained their autonomy over the course of the 19th century as the British cultivated friendly relationships with kind of the most powerful tribes in different regions along the coast, because the British want to have bases there, coaling stations, to recoal their ships going back and forth from India to Europe. Kuwait is a province within the Ottoman Empire at that time, so the British are not able to, if you will, kind of formalize their relationship with the local tribal chief. Once the Ottoman Empire collapses with World War I, Kuwait is one of the first autonomous nations that are created in that post-World War I period. And for the British, this is simply an extension of the policy that they've been pursuing over the previous 100 years. The El Sabah family has been the monarchical royal family of this province going back to the middle of the 18th century. And indeed, the current ruler of Kuwait, the current king of Kuwait, Sabah el-Ahmed, is a direct lineal descendant of the first Sabah ruler from the 18th century. What is ironic about that comparison between the origins of Kuwait and, say, the origins of Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Syria, and modern Iran is here we have this kind of pre-modern feudalism, right? This is a form of government that is utterly at odds with the modern assumptions about democracy and self-representation and consent and all of that, which the Western powers are sort of playing with those principles, trying at least in the abstract, to honor those principles with granting autonomy to the Arab peoples. Here we have the most pre-modern, the most feudal form of government, and yet in many ways it's the most authentic, it's the most legitimate. It is the government in this region, one of the governments that is going to be most unquestioned as valid and legitimate by the Kuwaiti peoples who live in the region under its control. We're going to see all these other governments in the Arab world being subject to turmoil and revolution and protest as in the process of Arab nationalization sort of progresses over the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. Kuwait is going to be, in comparison, a stable political environment. In many ways, this form of family rule over particular regions and subregions is the form of government that is most authentic to the cultural traditions of this region. And part of the collision that we're watching is the West coming in, trying to help, especially the Americans, but bringing a whole set of assumptions about the nature of sort of legitimate political systems that are going to cause turmoil in the region and become mixed up with the oil economy. As we come to recognize and appreciate the diversity of the origin stories of the nations in this region, and we're going to get to talk about several more in the coming class sessions, the remarkable uniqueness of the relationship between the United States and Saudi Arabia really becomes vivid and sort of impossible to ignore, if you will. Jurgen tells the story of FDR's shenanigans and kind of playing fast and loose with the rules of the Lend-Lease Act in order to direct support to King Saud during World War II. The problem being, of course, that the Congress approved the money in the Lend-Lease Act both for our Democratic allies and our Democratic allies who are fighting the Axis powers. Saudi Arabia didn't have an army, and King Saud couldn't send soldiers to fight the Germans. And of course, the primary irony is Saudi Arabia is no democracy. It is a monarchy. Of course, the United States and the Western Allies have a kind of geostrategic interest during the war of not having the Saudi government collapse or become allied with the Axis powers and start accepting aid from Germany in exchange for oil. So they want to keep King Saud neutral if he can't contribute to the war effort. But it's really the story at the end of chapter 20 that Jurgen tells about the visit by FDR to King Saud and to the Red Sea coast of Saudi Arabia and kind of the latter stages, the end stages of the war in February 1945 that captures kind of the spirit of the U.S.-Saudi relationship. And this is a kind of famous story about the transition in global power and global leadership from the British, who had been the great empire of the 19th century, to the Americans, who are going to become the great hegemonic power of the West in the post-World War II period. Now, as the story goes, the leaders of the three great Allied powers, that is Churchill for Britain, Stalin for the Soviet Union, and FDR for the United States, had their last great kind of summit conference in person of the war at Yalta, which is an island in the northern Mediterranean, in early February 1945. You may have read about the Yalta Conference in your earlier classes. So these great leaders, they all come aboard their own warships outside of this Mediterranean island, and they hold this conference. When the conference adjourns, both Roosevelt and Churchill leave Yalta to go visit King Saud, and Churchill's going to make some other stops on the way, so Roosevelt gets there first. Now, King Saud, for him, this is a really important for his international dignity, right? He's hosting the leaders of the great military powers. So, as in the kind of the tradition of the Arab desert tribal chief, right, the great wealthy tribesman, he comes to the coast of the Red Sea with hundreds of kind of courtiers and his royal family members and servants and whatnot, and flocks of sheep and goats and wagons or trucks full of vegetables and fruits, because King Saud's notion is he's hosting a great banquet for a fellow ruler. Right? This is kind of the etiquette, the Saudi etiquette. Now, when Roosevelt arrives, King Saud asked permission to come set up on the deck of the warship to hold a great feast. And Roosevelt welcomes him aboard, and they set up the tents and whatnot, and roll out the rugs and set out the pillows. And King Saud's cooks come on, and they've got the lambs and the goats on the Spitfire roasting, turning over the fire, and they have a great feast. Roosevelt and King Saud hit it off, and they make, sort of an understanding that there'll be negotiations in the aftermath of the war for American support. Just a couple weeks, FDR leaves. Just a couple weeks later, Churchill shows up, and King Saud wants to replicate this kind of great tribal feast, but of course Churchill refuses to allow him or his dirty goats on board a British naval vessel. Churchill instead will deign to come down on shore and join Saud at his feast, and notoriously, this is a notorious kind of anecdote about Churchill. When the meal is over and they're all sitting around on their cushions under the tent, Churchill orders his brandy and cigar. And he sits there and insists on drinking his brandy and smoking his cigar. And if you know anything about Islam, it is forbidden under Islam for pious Muslims to drink and smoke. So this is a great insult in Islamic culture for the Westerners to come and insist on having their alcohol and their tobacco. Churchill, of course, is acting out the role of the great European imperialist. He is notorious for, as much as we love Churchill for his leadership of Britain during World War II, his whole career was a kind of proud defense of the British Empire. And so he deigns to visit King Saud, but he needs to clearly demonstrate his cultural superiority to these kind of primitive desert tribesmen, if you will. Roosevelt, on the other hand, acts out the role of an American who is interested in a kind of diversity of culture, certainly, but a kind of equal partnership, if you will, both cultures respecting each other. So this has been a kind of famous anecdote for going on nearly a century now, better part of a century, and it really encapsulates both this transition from British to American leadership, global leadership that we're going to be talking about, and the particular kind of attachment of King Saud to the Americans, the way Saud saw the British as, kind of pretentious, arrogant colonizers, but he had a very different view of the Americans as, equal partners and liberators and people that would respect the Saudi national autonomy. It's really hard for us in the 21st century with American history, say in the last half century, to recapture that spirit of America as the global liberator in the aftermath of World War II. And this famous picture of FDR and Saud kind of laughing together, and you see kind of FDR's sincere, genuine interest in whatever it is that Saud is talking about, and that's this picture is taken to kind of illustrate or exhibit or encapsulate the unique U.S.-Saudi relationship. The first American company to begin exploring for oil in Saudi Arabia was Standard Oil of California, which purchased an oil concession from King Saud in 1939 for $1.5 million in gold bars. Now, this again is a kind of apocryphal story in the history of oil. This is something like buying the island of Manhattan for a string of beads, if you will. $1.5 million is just a minuscule amount of money for the trillions of dollars of oil wealth that Saudi Arabia is going to eventually produce. But if you remember back to the story of Everett Lee de Goyer at the beginning of chapter 20, he is doing his first comprehensive survey for oil in the Persian Gulf in 1943, 4 years after California Standard is going to pay $1.5 million for an oil concession, which should strike us as odd. Why would California Standard be paying for oil rights if nobody had the idea that there was oil in Saudi Arabia? And the explanation for this, which Jürgen relates, is that nobody expected there to be oil in Saudi Arabia. California Standard was essentially doing a payoff to King Ibn Saud to help prop up his government on the cusp of World War II. And you can see that in the kind of sub-headline here from the New York Times, 1939. It says, U.S. company wins Arabian oil grant. California Standard paying Ibn Saud $1.5 million in royalties. Axis and rivals lose. And so the subheadline there clearly shows the motivation. It was to give King Saud $1.5 million so that he wouldn't align himself with the Axis powers, with Germany or Japan, who no doubt would be very happy to give him $1.5 million. If not for oil, then to have German or Japanese naval bases in the middle of the Mediterranean, Persian Gulf, and North Indian Sea. In fact, King Saud had been trying to get Western oil companies, either British or American, but especially American, to come drill for water. That was King Saud's primary interest, and so he was happy to give away oil rights, which everyone assumed didn't exist, if it would get a company over to start plopping holes in the sand out in the desert to see if they couldn't hit water. King Saud thought that water in Saudi Arabia would be just as valuable as oil was up in Iran and Iraq. California Standard had no particular interest in doing, becoming a water drilling company, but they were under pressure from the federal government to make a payoff to King Saud to help prop up the Saudi government and to do them a solid by sending a crew or two over there and making King Saud happy by looking for some water wells, trying to drill some water wells for Saudi tribes. What that anecdote does reveal, of course, though, is this kind of developing relationship where independent, privately owned American oil companies are being put in the position of being kind of intermediary agents. They're being asked to carry out the foreign policy of sovereign governments, but not having government authority invested in them. And it's going to be this kind of one of the characteristic features of the oil industry in the middle of the 20th and the latter 20th century is the uneasy relationship that oil companies find themselves in because they are privately owned. They're not a government entity. Nevertheless, they're getting access to these extraordinary oil reserves only under the protection of their national governments. And we're going to have a kind of weird multi-layered geopolitics in the middle and later 20th century because of this developing relationship. And in the last third or so of chapter 20, Jurgen wants to walk us through why the alternatives are not viable. We end up with this structure because the other attempts that we made didn't pan out. And he gives two particular examples. The first is a kind of direct federal government control as exemplified by this cabinet officer, Harold Ickes, and his creation, the Petroleum Reserves Corporation. Now, because the Petroleum Reserve Corporation has that word corporation in it, it you're going to think that that is a privately held company. In fact, it's just the opposite. The proposal here, which Ickes makes in the middle of the war, now you have to imagine the urgency of wartime production and federal control of all aspects of industrial production across the United States. So the federal government is exerting its power to dictate wages. There are wage freezes. There are price controls. There's rationing among the civilian population, etc. So it's in the wave of this government control during the war that Ickes proposes the Petroleum Reserves Corporation. And essentially what this would be a department of the federal government. Again, even though it has that word corporation in it, this would be a federal department that would own American international oil concessions. That is to say, it would be the American federal government, a kind of department-appointed government agent negotiating with the Saudi Arabian government or the Kuwaiti government or any of the other governments that we had to interact with, and negotiating the government's purchase of that oil. Now, this was a kind of wartime measure. Jurgen describes a revolt by the American oil companies against this policy in the late stages of the war, and the end result is going to be our modern strategic petroleum reserves. And you may have heard reference to this before. The federal government does own several sites around the country where it stores vast quantities of reserved oil. And the idea is if there was ever a national emergency or a war, the government would have access to this reserve, and it has been used in the last half century or so since the 70s embargo. When there is a sudden dramatic spike in oil prices, the federal government has intermittently released sort of millions of barrels out of its reserves into the market to help kind of cushion and lower the price again. So there is a legacy of the Petroleum Reserves Corporation, but it was really defeated very quickly by the independent American oil companies. The other alternative that Jurgen discusses is the Anglo-American Petroleum Agreement. And the idea here is there would be a mutual agreement between the American and the British governments. Private companies would go in and develop and produce the oil and ship it to market and all the rest, but the national governments of these two countries would set quotas and would essentially dictate prices by dictating how much each company could produce within each of these countries. And in that way, they'd be able to maintain supply and impose national strategies or national priorities upon the oil companies. And again, Jurgen describes that there is the majors are less opposed to the Anglo-American Petroleum Agreement because they're very likely to get good shares out of it, right? It would still be private ownership. But in particular, the American independents, the Gulf Coast independents, revolted against this, and this also fails. So in the absence of effective government regulatory policy, right, an ability by these national governments to exert the authority and come to a common agreement to impose rules on the oil companies, what we are left with is those companies that are big enough to make a kind of instantaneous commitment, right, a commitment to instantaneous immediate development of the oil resources in these countries. What we want to observe through this period, and we'll talk more about in the next class session, is that these national governments, the Saudi government, the Iranian government, the Iraqi government, the Kuwaiti government, and others that we'll talk about, are putting tremendous pressure to maximize oil production. They want revenues so that they can deliver a better lifestyle to their peoples to prove their own legitimacy. These governments' legitimacy is shaky. They've all been created kind of by the Western powers or in pseudo support of the Western powers and been propped up. They have to prove to their people that they can deliver on the national resources and improve their livelihoods. And so they each want to maximize production. So it's only the oil companies who have enough capital resources that they can come in and essentially build up Kuwait from scratch into a modern, oil exporting infrastructure that are able to get into the game. So if you look at these 7 companies on your screen, these are sometimes referred to as the Seven Sisters. There was a famous documentary in the 1970s about how all these companies came into their claims in Persian Gulf oil, and the title of that documentary was The Seven Sisters. You can also think of them as the post-war majors. We recognize several of them right away, right? Standard Oil of New Jersey and Standard Oil of New York were the 2 biggest legacy companies of Standard Oil. They have been the biggest in virtually every aspect of the story we've told so far. British Petroleum and Royal Dutch Shell are the 2 major British companies, and we've talked about their background. Standard Oil of California is a Standard Oil legacy company. It's really not in the same scale as the East Coast companies, but as we just talked about, it was Standard Oil that went in and did the federal government a favor by giving King Saud $1.5 million in gold bars under a supposed oil contract that nobody thought would produce oil. So they got their foot in the door by playing ball with the feds in the build up to World War II. So California, Standard Oil of California is involved. And then these 2 others are the 2 Gulf Coast independents who are big enough to play with the big boys. Texaco is the major investor in American company in the Mexican oil industry, and so it really is very close to Exxon and Mobil in scale. And Gulf Oil has a particular specialization, that is to say that it was the Mellons and Gulf Oil that developed the pipeline and refinery system in the Texas Gulf Coast, and so they bring a particular kind of technical and engineering expertise that allows them to play with the other majors. In Chapter 21, then, Jürgen is going to explain the negotiations and the process by which these post-war majors came in and resettled or redistributed the oil claims of the Middle East. The first step in that process is the dissolution of the Turkish Petroleum Company and that Red Line Agreement from 1928. The Allied governments and the American and British oil companies are going to devise a kind of legal fiction that Jürgen refers to as supervening illegality as their excuse for dissolving the Turkish Petroleum Company. And what they're referring to essentially is, if you recall, Salus Gulbenkian, Mr. 5%, he was that former official of the Ottoman Empire before it fell at the end of World War I, who the Allies recruited as essentially the administrative authority who could sign off on the contracts and give away Ottoman oil claims. So Gulbenkian and his family, they're among the richest families in the world. They're living in Paris, sort of renting out a couple of floors of luxury hotels in downtown Paris, and the main offices of the Turkish Petroleum Company are in Paris. When the Germans invade Western Europe and conquer Western Europe in 1940, 1941, and they roll into Paris, Gulbenkian does not flee the city. Many people do. Many people who want to stay allied with and associate with the Western powers flee Paris as the Germans are coming in. Gulbenkian stays, and the Turkish Petroleum Company offices stay open during the German occupation. And so essentially the Western powers accuse Gulbenkian and the TPC of collaborating with the Nazis, right? Of opening up oil negotiations and giving access to the oil under the company's claims to the German enemy. So the Western powers use that fact as their rationale for dissolving the agreement that they had created in 1928. In its place, they're going to create a distinct state oil company for each of the nations that are emerging. Now, these were formally declared nations before World War II, but they're going to come into their own with American support and increasing encouragement by the Americans to develop their kind of own national autonomy and agency as a country in the world. The kind of meat and potatoes of chapter 21 then is Jurgen going through each of these three, really four companies and explaining the negotiations that led to their final composition. A couple of the big takeaways. Notice that the French lose all of their claims in these companies. There is no French company in any of the emerging state oil companies. That's a marker of France's sort of extremely weak position at the end of World War II. They've had their country taken over, their army has been destroyed, etc., etc. Notice that in Aramco, which is the Saudi Arabian state oil company, there are no British companies allied with the Americans. King Saud refuses to allow British companies into his kingdom. He is much enamored with the American oil companies. So you see SoCal, which we mentioned, had that very first oil concession from 1939, which was really a kind of charity gift to King Saud because no one was aware that there were significant oil reserves at the time. Texaco is by far the largest of all the independent companies in the United States, and then the two big boys, Standard Oil of New Jersey and Standard Oil of New York, Exxon and Mobil. The British are primary partners in the three other companies, but again, British geopolitical strength is so weakened in the aftermath of World War II, and their kind of economy has been so shattered by the war that they need major American partners if they're going to pull off the development of the oil resources in each of these countries. So we have the Iraq Petroleum Company that gets created in 1948, which is a partnership between British Petroleum, ExxonMobil, and this was the restricted claim that's allowed to Gulbenkian. He had 5% of all of the Ottoman oil concessions after World War I, and they give him kind of this legacy company. The Iraq Petroleum Company is, if you will, the direct legacy company of the Turkish Petroleum Company, so they permit Gulbenkian to essentially discourage him from filing lawsuits and from interrupting the progress of these companies. That's where Gulbenkian's share lies. And then Kuwait becomes a distinct thing. It is a partnership between BP and Shell. So this is the one place where we have Shell intervening or participating. And they also recruit this other independent company, Gulf Oil, in particular for Gulf's expertise with building pipelines and refineries. If you think about the positioning of Kuwait, kind of at the base of the Mesopotamian Valley, at the headwaters of the Persian Gulf, it is ideally located to become the refining center, if you will. Iranian oil, Iraqi oil, Saudi oil can all intersect there right at the peak of the Gulf, and so Kuwait sees for itself the major Kuwaiti oil reserves are going to be offshore, and we're not going to discover them really till the 1970s into the early 1980s. So the Kuwaitis are not thinking so much that they have enormous oil reserves, but they are thinking that they're perfectly geographically situated to become the pipeline refining center of this entire region. Now, it's important to remember, and we've emphasized this before, Iran, or Persia, before it became known as Iran, was never part of the Turkish Petroleum Company. It was never part of, well, in the distant past, it had been part of the Ottoman Empire, but not by the time of World War I. So that's a distinct agreement. But again, BP is so weakened, and the British kind of naval authority and ability to support British oil companies is so weakened in the aftermath of World War II that they have to bring in the two big American companies, Exxon and Mobil, to become primary partners with them. In each of these examples, what you see is the declining global leadership of Britain, which again had been the major empire of the 19th century, the great global power of the 19th century, can no longer sustain its imperial commitments, and increasingly the Americans have to come in and buttress and support the British and sort of, if you will, create a protected zone so the British can still be there. That theme is going to continue through the coming class sessions as we watch this, as we watch the Americans emerge as the great global superpower, at least of the free West, right? We have to remember that the world is divided in two, and the Soviet Union is the dominant power behind essentially half of the global economy. But what we see in these companies is a kind of next step forward in their national autonomy, right? If you think about the League of Nations mandates and the Red Line Agreement of the post-World War I period, there's this kind of pseudo-independence, this kind of apprenticeship on the way to national independence, and the Americans are very interested in taking the next step, right? So you still got British capital and Western capital and Western expertise in these companies, but the major advancement here is Saudi Arabia gets its own independent oil company. Everyone recognizes its territorial boundaries, and whoever is going to come drill for oil has to negotiate with Aramco. And same with Iraq, same with Kuwait. That was not true under the Red Line Agreement. The Western powers presumed to exert an authority, a legal authority that transcended the national boundaries that they had created, right? And that was kind of the essential contradiction or confusion of that post-World War I period is going to become clarified, if you will, here in the post-World War II period. Now, having a national oil company also means that oil politics is going to become intertwined with, intermeshed with the story, each one of these nations' story of the struggle for national independence and autonomy and respect in the world, being treated as a country every bit the equal of European countries, etc. And that's going to form a major theme in the narrative we want to tell in the coming class sessions. Okay, so let's leave chapter 21 here, and we'll pick up with chapter 28 in the next class session.